All right, everybody, here we go. Chapter 1 of CSD3201. We're going to talk about language and language disorders and give just an overview that will allow you to differentiate among speech, language, and communication and explain the characteristics of each of those. And then again, just a really brief overview of the characteristics of language disorders. So, and I think some students have a hard time at first really differentiating between speech and language. So, speech is the neuromuscular act of producing sounds that are used in language. The muscles involved in speech production are coordinated by the brain to produce the sounds of language. So with speech, right, it's just the one way to output language, right? So it's really important to think about sign language, right? So that you can completely have language 100% receptive and expressively without any speech, right? If I can sign, I have language. I don't need any speech at all. So that's one way to think about speech, that speech is just sort of the outputting of sounds used in language. It's one way to help convey language to another person, but it's not language, and they're very separate things, and we'll talk more about that. Language is the comprehension and or use of a spoken, listening and speaking, written, reading and writing, and or other communication symbol systems, such as American Sign Language. All right. Language is a rule-governed symbol system for communicating means through a shared code of arbitrary symbols. All right, and let's kind of talk about these. So let's think about rule-governed, right? So language has so many rules to it. I think sometimes people don't realize, right, that as I'm talking right now, I'm putting every word in a specific order. If I was to use the exact same words, but to put them in a different order, you wouldn't be able to understand what I'm saying, even though I'm using the exact same words. Also, right, we've got arbitrary symbols, right, that we call a chair because at some point people just, in English, just decided to call a chair, right? Society just said, yeah, that's a good name for that thing. So there's no actual reason why a chair is a chair and a table is a table. We've just decided to it. It's completely arbitrary, and yet there are tons and tons of rules for how we use language. So language has some important characteristics. Number one, it's universal among humans. So all people have language. No matter where you go, no matter what continent you're on, people have and pretty much have always had some kind of language. Language is generative. So, and when we say generative, it means that new words can appear all the time and do appear, right? The word computer at some point was new, right? We've got new words used all the time, especially in technology. So it's not just a set of, an already planned set of words or how we use words together, right? It can grow and grow and grow in terms of the kind of words we have, the kind of words we use. Language is also really creative. So little children, one thing we'll talk about in a second is that it's learned really quickly by young children. So it's not like language for people is as complicated as, okay, let's all learn trigonometry or something, right? That's not really natural for kids to learn. It's something that you have to learn in school. Whereas children, just by listening to people talk and watching them, they're able to learn it. And it's creative in that even young children can create sentences that they've never heard before. So just by hearing a bunch of words that people talk and say, all of a sudden little kids can create a sentence that they've never actually heard before, but they've made it up. So, I have a kindergartner, and maybe he's talking about Paw Patrol that he watched on TV, and he uses words that have never been used before. No one has ever said these exact words about Paw Patrol before, but he does. And they're meaningful, they're in the right order, so that he created a new sentence, and that even little kids can do this. So that's also really important. So, and then it's also decontextualized. All right. So, and this has a little to do with semantics too, but so by decontextualized, right, we don't have to just talk about what's in front of us, right? We can talk about things that happened previously. We can talk about things that are going to happen in the future. We can talk about things that have never happened, right? We can create stories like Harry Potter and other stories that are not true, have never happened to anybody, and yet, they're not happening right now. And that's one reason why, for years and years, people argued that language was species specific, right? My dogs can tell me a lot of things. They can tell me that they're hungry. They can tell me that they're excited to go for a walk. They can tell me that the mailman just drove down the driveway. Right, so they can communicate really well, but for years people would argue that it's not language. And the reason it's not language is that even if my dogs were able to speak, we weren't sure that, my Great Pyrenees could sit on the couch and go, hey, remember that time last year when we went camping and I got to swim in the lake? That was awesome. I'd really like to do that again. Right? That what we think, or at least what we used to think, is that animals weren't able to do that. That they were only able to, all right, I'm hungry, so I'll communicate. I want to go for a walk right now, so I'll communicate. I sense an intruder, so I'll communicate. Right, but it was all contextualized. It was things happening right now, but maybe that's not true. So one thing I want you to think about, is language unique to humans? Can other animals have language, right? So can other animals make up their own language? Can they add words? Can they, have all the complicated things that language belongs, and not just speech or communication, that's true language. So, and then it's also really important to remember, and we'll talk a lot more about this, especially at the end of the semester, are language differences and variations. So a language dialect is a variation of a symbol system used by a group of individuals that reflects and is determined by shared regional, social, or cultural ethnic factors. So things like African American English are going to be a dialect. If you go to New Orleans and areas where, in that area of Louisiana and parts of Mississippi, right, there's definitely a Cajun influenced dialect. So you're in different places. We're going to have many different dialects throughout the country, right? But that, that's part of English, but it's just a natural, normal variation of the English language. All right, so we've got expressive and receptive language. Expressive language is language that is produced, so spoken, signed, or written, and receptive language is language that is understood, so listening and comprehending. Communication is the process participants use to exchange information, ideas, needs, and desires. All right, we'll talk about this first. So communication requires a sender. It requires a receiver, right? So it's got to have at least two people or two animals or two somethings, right? If you're talking to yourself in the shower about what you need to get done today, that's not really communication because it's just you, right? You're just talking, sort of thinking out loud. You're not communicating. You've got to have a sender and a receiver. You've got to have a shared intent to communicate, and you've got to have a shared means of communication. So I do not know sign language. So if somebody who only uses sign language and is nonverbal, I can't communicate with them. There'll be two of us. There'll be a sender and a receiver. There'll be a shared intent to communicate. They will want to communicate with me. I will want to know what they're saying, but we do not have a shared means of communication. So I don't know what they're saying. So you've got to have all four of those things in order to have communication. And again, remember, right, you can have communication without having language, right? If you, right, if somebody says something really stupid and you go, right, I haven't used language, that wasn't language, but you know what I mean. So I've communicated, but without language. So you can communicate without language. However, if you're using language, you are communicating. So, right, you can communicate without language and without speech. You can just communicate, right? However, if you're using language with another person, you're communicating, right? But I guess you could be talking to yourself using language, but not communicating. So I guess that is true, right? And then speech, right? Speech is if you're using speech, almost by definition, you're using some form of language along with it. And then if there's another person, you're communicating, right? So all these things are intertwined and go together, but they're also three separate issues, right? I, as a person who stutters, right, I know what I want to say, right? I've got the language in my head. It's, lined up just like anybody else, and then I can't get it out, right? I get stuck on a word doesn't come out, right? That is a speech disorder. It's not a language disorder. There's nothing different about the language I have and I'm ready to use. It's just a speech disorder, and that impacts my communication abilities. Okay. All right, language disorder. A language disorder is impaired comprehension and or use of spoken, written, or other symbol systems, right, including sign language, things like that. The disorder may involve the form of language, and that can be phonology, right? And so that's like the speech sounds of language. Morphology, which is the meaningful units of language. And I usually think especially of things like ing, plural s, things like that. And then syntax is correct word order, is really important. So that's form. We can have a involvement with content or semantics, so think about vocabulary with that, and or function of language, pragmatics, so how we're going to socially use language, right, can be really important too. And we'll talk more about those. That's going to be a big part of chapter 2, is breaking those down. I know you've probably had those before, but they're super important, so we're going to talk about them more here. Children who have comprehension or receptive difficulties may have trouble with what? So if a child has a hard time understanding language, what's that going to cause? What are they going to have difficulty with? And then children who have language production or expressive difficulties may have trouble with what? I want you to think about what kinds of difficulties might those kids have. Remember, this could be spoken and or written language for both comprehension and production. And sign language, of course, too, right? It can be pervasive or limited, right? So it can go, you can have a language disorder that goes across form, content, and function, or it can be limited where maybe it's only vocabulary that you have a hard time with, or only syntax, right? And then it can be mild to severe. And it could be mild to severe in each of those areas, right? Maybe vocabulary, word finding, content is a severe disorder, and then you've got more of a mild disorder in the form of language. So, right, it can really change up as far as, what kind of disorder we have, how pervasive, and how severe it is. And then I want to talk about these terms with you in class. These are in your book, so things like language deviance, language delay, person first language, identity first language, right? Why might we use some and not others? Okay, so that is chapter 1.